there will be a certain heaviness in you that will be acquired from the stories of people, and you will carry it with you, and you will be a changed person, because the work that you are doing and the voices that you are recording, they matter so much more than how you are feeling.
Hello, and welcome to the third season of the Anahita Speaker Series presented by Carnegie India. The Anahita Speaker Series celebrates stirring stories of empowerment, struggle, and success from women professionals in different fields across the globe. Stories we hope are bound to inspire young professionals. I'm a Nahat Kaur Research Assistant and Program Coordinator for the Security Studies Program at Carnegie India. We are delighted to have with us today Aanchal Malhotra. Aanchal is an oral historian and writer from Delhi. She is the co-founder of the Museum of Material Memory, a crowdsourced digital repository tracing family histories and social ethnography through heirlooms, collectibles, and antiques from the Indian subcontinent. She writes extensively on the 1947 partitions and its related topics. Her first book, Remnants of Separation, was published in 2017 and has great critical acclaim. It is our pleasure to have you with us today, Aanchal. So, starting off with the first question, as an oral historian, you've written so vastly on the partition and its long-standing effects till in this generation as well. Could you tell us a little bit about your journey as an oral historian, and if you faced any obstacles as a woman in the field of in oral history?
That's such a great question. And I think my first response would be that because I didn't come from a field of history or literature, my biggest challenge was learning about the craft of oral history itself, which meant learning on the job as I was speaking to people. I come from the world of visual art. I was trained as a printmaker. So, to not only familiarize yourself with the terrain of partition, but also how to ask questions about it empathetically and in a nuanced fashion, was something that will continue to be a challenge for me, I think, because each interview is different and you learn with every conversation you have. I think apart from that, one of the major challenges I faced was how to represent an event that has um, for so long been represented in almost a singular monolith way, which is through the lens of violence and trauma. How to represent it in a different way or through varying perspectives so that people can see the event as something that is evolving and not a static event from the past. It has to be something that has resonance today, that has obviously a longer lasting effect. And then to your last question of being a woman in the field of oral history, I think this is something that I faced from day one, because even as a field researcher, there are places and times of day, very simply put, that men can venture out to do their research where women can't. That's the first thing. The other thing was how to be taken seriously as a woman historian in a field largely dominated by men. How to, not only is the field ageist and sexist, but I found myself overcompensating in very strange ways, like wearing my glasses to academic panels or wearing a sari to look older because people belittle you otherwise. And they did for many years. Now it's been 10 years that I've been writing about this, and I have established my work in a way that people do take it seriously. But I think at the beginning, when you're in your 20s, it is very hard, particularly if you're doing something which is a new way of looking at an older event. There will always be questions. There will always be, oh, but you're only writing about memory. and memory is not history. Memory is not truth. But I think every woman in every field does navigate this, you know, and obviously does face this as well.
That's a brilliant answer, Aanchal. Just something that you mentioned earlier was the asking questions to people and the challenges that come with it. Can obviously your work involves a lot of personal history and memories that emerge from very deep-seated traumas. How do you personally navigate the emotional intensity that comes from listening to these and documenting these personal accounts? And what do you think is the best way to approach your subjects about these things?
To be completely honest, I never realized that the recording of these multiple stories was doing anything to me until about 5 years into the process. Because every day you are receiving stories of trauma and violence, but apart from that, also just a completely different time and age and difficult circumstances that people had to live through, and you're receiving them, and it's a privilege to receive them in a way that you don't actually think that anything you are feeling matters in that moment, because for most people it's the first time that they would have spoken about these things with anyone. And that's a really privileged position to be in, to be the receiver of these memories. But I think I realized that it was doing something to me only when I interviewed a woman uh, who spoke about such. The interview was so horrific. It had abduction and rape and concentration camps and walking through fields and giving birth during partition. I mean, there was so much violence in that. And I think that was the first time I had to take a step back. And the problem was that I kept dreaming about these things. And I kept thinking about them, and they entangled and enmeshed themselves into my daily life, as they would when you talk to people on an everyday basis about these things. But I think it's very important to understand what aged trauma can do to the listener and how it changes their lives. And the way that I dealt with it was taking a pause from the research. And the other thing that I was very curious about was how other people, other oral historians who recorded these things of trauma, dealt with it on their end. So I did interviews with other oral historians to understand their mechanisms of coping. But I think eventually you do realize that there will be a certain heaviness in you that will be acquired from the stories of people, and you will carry it with you, and you will be a changed person, because the work that you are doing and the voices that you are recording, they matter so much more than how you are feeling. I think it was more important for me to understand that these stories needed to come out from my generation and the generation after. Then maybe it's not a good thing than to really think about what they were doing to me. And I wish sometimes that I had thought more deeply about that.
Right. Achal, just a question on what you said. Obviously, all these stories have a very heavy connotation to them, and you said that they personally affect you, like dream about these things, and it is a big challenge. Do you think this has affected your writing on partition in some way, like how you personally feel about these events?
It has made it more visceral. It's made it more visceral for sure. And the one thing it has done is taught me that there is no one way to talk about partition. There is a real danger in painting partition as a singular, homogeneous testimony, because there were so many varying groups involved that have varying perspectives. And I learned very quickly to unlearn and relearn. So I think it's taught me that. It's taught me a sense of openness. When I go to speak to somebody, I know that the story I will hear will not be the same as any other story I've heard. You know.
So, just from that, Anchal, you obviously have lineage that comes from the partition. At what point in your life did you realize the gravity of your lineage, and how did you come to the realization of you wanting to convey your family history through academic scholarship?
I think it came to me rather late, in my early 20s. And I was a bit embarrassed that I had no idea about the fact that all four of my grandparents had been impacted by partition. What struck me was that if I knew so little, then the generation that came after me would know even less. And eventually, history would sort of get distorted or dissolve into nothingness. Family history, because we are keepers of oral histories. We pass stories down orally, no one ever writes anything. And this was the case with so many families. So I think, yes, it was inspired very much by my own family and not having a written history, but I wanted to write not just about partition, but the human beings during partition. People that, for most of our scholarship, were data or statistics. They became numbers. And I wanted to write about their circumstances and their fears and their anxieties and how their feelings. I wanted to write about their feelings. And I guess, inspired by the stories of my family, I wanted to write a human history of partition.
Achal, in most of your writing, you've, like you mentioned, highlighted the human aspect. You've like bypassed the numbers and the statistics and highlighted the human aspect of the partition. Another thing that has really impacted your writing is material memory. So, alongside your writing career, you're also the founder of the Museum of Material Memory, which is the first of its kind in India. It is a digital repository which traces culture in the Indian subcontinent through materials such as heirlooms, books, art, household decor, and some very basic items. Can you tell me what was the driving force behind this project?
The simple answer would be that I was writing about objects of partition in my own life. And, you know, particularly I think in South Asian families, we are collectors or almost hoarders of objects. And what we don't realize is that we deposit parts of ourselves into those objects, whether it is an aged object or an object of everyday use. And I saw this in my research. I saw it, for example, I remember speaking to a woman who showed me a shawl that had come from what is now Pakistan to India. And at the beginning of our conversation, she was very nonchalant about that shawl. Oh, yes, my mother gave it to me, and I wore it as I walked to India. But at the end of the conversation, after 2 or 3 hours of speaking about that shawl, I said, "Oh, may I borrow this shawl for my research? I'll return it to you." And she said, "No, no, no, it's mine. It's my mother's. It has so much importance in it." So I think we need sometimes an external force to show us how objects have this power of transportation, but also power of memory. And to touch them and caress them and smell them and feel them sometimes really can take you to another time and place. So, in my own work, I was writing about objects of partition, but there are aged objects throughout the subcontinent. And along with a friend, we decided to set up a digital archive to invite people to write about old objects in their home. You may see like an ink pot on a shelf in your grandmother's house, and you must have seen it since you were a child, but now this may give you an opportunity to ask about it and ask about the person that it belonged to. So I think it was a way to start to archive the material culture of the subcontinent in a borderless manner, which is why it's also a digital archive, so that people from Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Afghanistan can access it and see the similarity, I think, between the ways in which we live in our houses.
Absolutely, I think that's a great answer. The whole initiative in itself is just brilliant. Just coming from that, you've obviously been through a lot of family histories. You've heard a lot of stories about the partition. Could you share with us a very particular significant moment or experience from your career as an oral historian?
I think it would have to be when the people that I had interviewed saw their stories printed in the book and saw younger people reading it and being influenced by it and sharing it and then talking to their family members about it. Because in a lot of the interviews I did, I would I would hear this line a lot. Oh, but what will it change? You're asking these things about the past. What will it do? And I actually didn't know whether it would do anything because 60, 65 years had passed since partition. Would anyone be interested? Would it make any difference? But then I don't think I ever expected the work to receive the kind of love that it did, the kind of interest that it did. And I think, especially with younger people, I was very moved by how much people's stories mattered. I think that was really valuable to me because survivors live with their stories on an everyday basis. For them, it is a part of their lives. And yes, it is meaningful to have someone come and dedicatedly interview you or talk to you with interest for a number of hours. It gives it a certain kind of, I mean, I don't like to use the word validity, but it is meaningful to them. And I don't know whether it brings any closure, but it does start the conversation often within their homes. But then to see the stories read by people not just in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, but to be read across the world and to for people far removed from the site of trauma to understand in a nuanced and human way what it means for the subcontinent and how it can explain a lot of migration patterns across the world, but also a lot of you know uh, qualities and characteristics within migrant families as well that were impacted by partition. I think I was completely unprepared for that.
Absolutely. I remember when I read your first book, I was in the first year of college, and it was the first time that I was so viscerally exposed to the partition and the events that followed after. It actually pushed me to have a conversation in my family about where we come from, if we have any relatives who've migrated from the partition. I think the books really did have that conversation going. So,
Thank you. That means a lot, actually.
absolutely. So, when we talk about families in partition, at any point did you have any reservations or apprehensions of making your family history so accessible to the public, to everyone out there?
Constantly. Constantly, even now. I think more than like making it available to people out there, it is within your own family. You're writing about your family, you don't know how they will perceive it. And the thing that I am always very careful about is whenever I write about anyone, family or stranger, I always share the interview with people. And it's with their permission that the interview goes into any book or any piece or anything. So they know what I'm writing and they have approved of what I'm writing. But I think it does make you incredibly vulnerable. However, I will say that I always think about the interview process. I have this informal thing that I say called the plateau method. That if you want your interviewee to arrive at a certain moment in their history and divulge just the vulnerabilities that make that history, then you have to do the same. And perhaps writing about your own family is one way of doing it, situating yourself within the conversation. And I wrote about this particularly in my second book because it was with younger people, it was with descendants, and I felt very much participant in the process. And I often, in a way that I never did with my first book with survivors, that when younger people were discussing their family histories, I responded saying, yes, I understand, or this is the case in my family too. And in that way, you embroider yourself into every conversation. And I think with my second book, I was a lot more liberal in doing so. But it's very yeah, I think about it even now. I think about how much of me I'm putting out onto the page and how much of people that I love are also being put on the page.
Absolutely. Uh, can you tell me, are there any female figures who've inspired your work and your journey in on the partition? Can you tell us a little bit about the role they've played in your professional and your creative journey?
Yes. Well, the two people that immediately come to mind who were just incredible in giving advice and support are Ritu Menon and Urvashi Butalia. They are women that started the area of oral history and partition, and I was very grateful to be able to discuss my work with them. Other women writers who write on partition, people of my age, Anam Zakaria, Kavita Puri. Um, I'm very grateful to constantly have them to riff off ideas or just, I think these are people that inherently understand the challenges that you face, the feelings that you have, sometimes that you can't even put into words after an interview or uh, you know a, after you transcribe an interview and you have the voice in your head and you don't really know how you feel about it. I think people that write on the subject, they know inherently what you feel and what you mean. So I'm very grateful to have women writers who write on the same subject as friends as well. And then on a larger scale, perhaps someone like Svetlana Alexievich, who has been writing in the genre of oral history for nearly 3 decades, I think. And her work always inspires and informs and shows me new ways to think about my own.
Just to segue from your work as a writer, can you tell me, if it wasn't for what you're doing right now as an oral historian, what do you think would be your alternative career choice?
Oh, well, I came from the world of art, so I would probably still be a printmaker. And if not that, honestly, this is really weird, but I would probably be an interior designer or something. I love, yeah, uh, I'm very particular about my house, and yeah, those are the two things I can think of.
That's brilliant. Also, beyond your professional reading, what else do you think are hobbies and activities that keep you engaged?
Oh, that's a good question to which I have a, I don't know if I have a good answer. I'm a bit of a workaholic. It's not a good thing. Um, but when I'm not writing or thinking about writing or transcribing or reading for writing, I do really love to read for pleasure. And I grew up in a bookseller's family, and I've always read ever since I've been a child. So that's something I love doing. And apart from that, just spending some time with my family and my dogs. Maybe I should get more hobbies. That's what this is showing me.
I don't think so. I think reading is it occupies you a lot. Just because you
I
mentioned
agree.
reading, can you tell me, what do you remember is the first book that really had an impact on you, or that pushed you to read more or like expand your reading capacity?
I don't think I have a definitive answer for that. And I've tried to think over the years many times what the first books I read were. But honestly, because my grandfather had this bookshop, we always had books in the house. And I don't ever actually think anyone motivated me towards reading. I think I just inherently knew ever since I could read that this was it was so easily available, and now I consider that a real privilege because I know people that didn't grow up like that, and um, I feel really privileged to have been surrounded by books ever since I was born. It was really just an extension of your landscape, you know. So I read everything from the Agatha Christie to Sweet Valley High as a child, comic books, the classics, and I don't think I was as choosy as well. I read everything. I mean, I remember my childhood being dominated by books.
Just because you mentioned books and a little bit of fiction, I wanted to ask you that your fictional debut, The Book of Everlasting Things, got published in December 2022. Can you tell us about what influenced the transition from oral history to historical fiction?
I think when you're recording oral history, you have such a you're dedicated to recording it as it is told to you. You cannot alter it, you cannot edit it. But over the years, recording so many different interviews gives you a sense, a larger sense of partition. And I think I had an idea for a story that worked best as fiction. And I tried my hand at it. But I don't think I could have written fiction without writing oral history because I needed to be embedded in the landscape of partition so deeply to be able to nuancedly write about it in fiction as well. And I think fiction gives you the freedom that I had never experienced when writing oral history. You could suddenly move characters around and you could give them different characteristics and edit their memory and withhold from the audience in a way that this sounds withholding is such a bad word, um, but I just think the kind of elasticity of fiction was very interesting to me, and it was very challenging as well, but I enjoyed it. And it I wrote, it took 5 years to write the book, so obviously I was very invested in it as well.
Archer, over 7 decades have passed since the partition, and it remains a pertinent event even today. How do you think the continuum of the historical legacy of the partition can be maintained for the future generations? And what do you think, along with academic scholarships, what other avenues can be explored to preserve the legacy of the partition?
That's a great question. um, the first thing I want to say is any event seen through the prism of memory will always offer us endless possibilities to remember it by. um, every generation will have a new way to find associations to the event and relate to it in their own way. Many people tell me that partition is a subject that has no interest anymore, but I don't think that's true. I don't think it'll ever be true, in fact. There will never be a time where we will exhaust the possibilities of what all we can explore within the landscape of partition. In terms of keeping it alive, I think there are museums that have come up in India and Pakistan. There are archives that survive now that have interviewed thousands of people. Um, the one thing that I was very struck by is the lack of memorials, though. Take, for example, our city of Delhi, where I live, where thousands of refugees came and started their lives after partition in camps like Kingsway Camp in North Delhi, or Sarojinagar Camp, or Purana Killa, or Humayun's Tomb. In these places, there is not a single plaque uh, that tells you that millions of people came here, how they lived, what they ate, how many tents were there, how they educated themselves, how they started their lives. I think this is really important because these are really historic moments. And I wish that there is some sort of just some sort of understanding of what happened in the place that it happened. I would love to see it. I visited these places many times, but I never see anything. And it's not that hard to put up a memorial plaque and to do a bit of research around the place. So I think something like that would be good, just to make subsequent generations also aware of what happened in the places that they frequent on an everyday basis, right? That these were uh, parts of history.
This has been a very enriching conversation, Achal. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was a great conversation and we all learned a lot. I hope our audience enjoys this episode. Do subscribe to Carnegie India's YouTube channel for more such content. Thank you.